It's a very important day in the history of America.
Let's start it 10 years ago. There was a White House Correspondents' Dinner where Trump was invited, and Obama and others just all made fun of him, the audience, really brutally. A fuse was lit in him then. And so the 2015 campaign, he decided to take it seriously. We're in a high volatility time. By 2024, we have digital separation already that's taken place. You know, it's like North Korea and South Korea. 96% of Democrats in one study do not marry Republicans.
These are the two new religions of America.
Yeah, exactly. For many people, if they don't believe in God, they believe in the state.
How do the Republicans look at Obama's tenure and how do the Democrats look at it?
I mean, Republicans are just negative on everything Obama-related and everything Democrat-related at this point. In 2012, the campaign was run not on economics, but on race and gender and this kind of stuff. And so wokeness exploded. Right after 2020, boom, guess what? Racism solved. The level of cynicism here is on another level, like literally causing billions of dollars in riots and having people all fight each other just to boost their stock price for a few $1 million or to win an election.
If you had to summarize Biden's 4 years of being a president, how do you explain it?
Disaster. Think of Biden as like a ventriloquist dummy where like people write something for the teleprompter and then he reads it off, right?
Is it almost certain that Trump's going to win this election now?
I wouldn't say that. And the reason I wouldn't say that is arguably, frankly, the entire economy of the U.S. is fake. How much debt is the U.S. government borrowing every quarter? $7 trillion it did in COVID. So you're borrowing close to record amounts of money at decadal high rates. And that's why the payments are just going like that. It's somebody who's completely bankrupt and maxing out their credit cards to eke out a few more months, maybe pass the election, maybe not. There's a time bomb on the world economy.
If you know who Balaji Srinivasan is, then skip to the main podcast. You don't need this intro. If you don't know who Balaji Srinivasan is, we've done 2 stellar geopolitics themed episodes with him. More importantly, he's one of the top voices in the tech world. He's one of the top X accounts when it comes to the world of tech, and people look forward to each of his tweets because they're extremely sharp, extremely deep, and extremely insightful. On his recent India visit, we did 2 extremely elaborate conversations with him. This one is centered around American politics and the role of America in the geopolitical landscape of the world. If you're someone who knows Balaji S, you're in for something special. And if you're someone who isn't familiar with his work, I personally advise you to sit down, relax, and absorb all the knowledge within this person's head. He's one of those guests that we only have the pleasure of recording with about once or twice a year, but it's always an extremely deep and insightful conversation. The world is not ready for the greatness that exists within this man's brain. It's Balaji Srinivasan who returns on TRS. It's a very important day in the history of America, probably for the wrong reasons.
Yep, unfortunately, yep.
We got to talk about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. But this podcast is also catered to audiences that are not familiar with American politics. So we'll go over Biden's last 4 years, Trump's 4 years while he was the president, and possibly the upcoming 4 years as well when it comes to American politics, because American politics affects the geopolitics of our world. So Balaji Srinivasan, welcome back to TRS. It's a very special episode.
Great to be here.
Okay. Do you want to dive straight into the assassination attempt?
All right, so let's go to the clip, see what happened.
Oh, man. That's crazy. This moment probably won him the presidential election.
The reaction. So first, that entire series of events is there's so many things just in terms of the Twitter discussion of that and so on. So like, you know, for example, this clip, I don't think you understand what men feel in their souls when watching this footage, right? Because you know, shots on Trump, returns fire. In a minute, he manages to regain his presence of mind and inspire the crowd that had been counting on him to live and lead them, right? And, so this is a friend of mine. He said he always thought Trump was a vapid showman. Impressive to see the dog in him. Changes everything, right?
Wow.
And the reason is because Trump didn't serve in the military and so on and so forth, right? But this is actually something which is essentially impossible to fake, that level of physical courage, right? And then the famous, photo now, which is, so this photo from this angle with the flag in the background, defiant with the blood on his face, is actually just this remarkable thing.
The only context I want to give as an Indian is we have completely external perspective. We're not on the Democrat side or the Republican side.
Totally.
But often when we speak to our American friends, we see extremely strong political opinions.
Absolutely.
And both the sides think that the other one is an idiot.
Yes, that's right.
So that's the Indian context. Now, Balaji, you go on.
So my view on this, to relate it to the Indian context, is around mid-century, India went through partition and China went through its civil war. And now, in many ways, India and also China are more unified, centralized than they've ever been. But around the 1950s, America was highly unified, highly centralized. It was a very functional society. And now it is in its time of partition. It is now something where there's essentially, it's not really civil war, I'd call it communal violence, to use the Indian phrase. And blue and red, I can show graphs of this, but for example, Democrats don't marry Republicans.
Don't marry Republicans.
96% of Democrats in one study do not marry Republicans.
Holy shit.
Okay. So what that means is ideology becomes biology in one generation. It's not just a voting thing. It's like Protestant, Catholic, or Sunni Shiite. It's actually like a tribal thing.
These are the two new religions of America.
Yeah, exactly. And they're essentially different views on not what GOD should do, but what GOV should do.
What is that?
Meaning it's not about God, it's about the state, the government,
okay.
right? And
Gov instead of God.
Yes, exactly. And that's actually a deep point. There's a lot of folks who have written about how, and I've also written about this, how for many people, if they don't believe in God, they believe in the state. They've replaced, especially if they're a secular nationalist, the government is the Leviathan that hovers above. Like if you believe in Almighty God, then you believe, that there is some force that will reward you or punish you or what have you. There's polytheistic versions of that as well, obviously. But if you don't believe in that, you only believe in the boys in blue and the U.S. military, and there's a transference of worship. So because Americans have become much less religious, they put their fate in the state or something else they talk about, the network. That's the other thing. Basically, depending on what you think of as the most important force in the world, the most powerful force, is it Almighty God, is it the U.S. military, or is it encryption?
So,
right. But I'll come back to that point.
Yeah.
Yep.
What decides the election result? For example, if I had to give you the Indian context on that,
right.
There's different social stratas and different aspects decide the vote in the different social stratas.
So the thing about this is it's like tuning into a very long running serial on episode 97. Okay. And you're 10 seasons in to the Trump show. Okay. And I have to remember that every year there are some new kids who are just paying attention for the first time. They're like 14 or 15 or 17, and they were just, in middle school or what have you, and they're just starting to become sentient human beings and picking their head up and trying to make sense of things. So, obviously you can start history all the way back in, 2000 BC or what have you, right? But let's start it 10 years ago. So 2015 was the beginning of the official Trump era in U.S. politics. So Trump had been around for many years. He'd been the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and now the 2020s. For 5 decades, he's been a famous American figure. Even the 80s rappers are making songs about Donald Trump. Why is that? Because he was like a very flamboyant billionaire real estate developer in New York. He sought the press out. He wanted them to write about him. He wanted the coverage and so on and so forth. And then he reinvented himself multiple times. He became like, had a reality TV show, The Apprentice. That's right. And so he broadcast, he got his name, and he set up the whole show for himself to say, you're fired, to evaluate and so on and so forth. And he actually did a bunch of runs for president just to get his name out there as sort of a toy kind of thing. But in the early 2010s, he got into effectively like a PR scuffle with Obama, where Trump contended that Obama had actually either not been born in the U.S. or was, it was like not a Christian or something like that. The whole birth certificate thing. And what happened, without getting into all of that, there was a White House Correspondents' Dinner where Trump was invited, and Obama and others just all made fun of him, the audience, really brutally, right? And maybe, you can argue he dished it out, he should be able to take it and so on. But many people think a fuse was lit in him then. And so the 2015 campaign, he decided to take it seriously. And so go ahead.
Can we pause this narrative just for a bit?
Yep.
Could you give me the opinion of the Republicans on Obama's tenure as well as the Democrats on Obama's tenure?
Oh, it's so polarized right now. In fact, I can show you a graph where the moment the presidency switches sides, everybody's opinions of the economy and so on just totally flip, or what have you. But basically, Democrats generally, and I mean this in almost a literal sense, I can probably find it to put it on screen. Yeah, like this kind of thing. This has been done so many times at this point that it's worn off. They called Bush Hitler. They called Romney a fascist. Everybody is called a Nazi, fascist, etc. So by sheer overuse, if you go and read communist propaganda, for example, you will see that they do the same thing. Everybody's a fascist, Nazi, et cetera, et cetera. And so unlimited force is justified against them. They're the enemy. And, there's various graphs, for example, on polarization over time in the US. And they tend to show that the left, here was like a rough center over here, right? And what happened was the left polarized first. The left moved further left first.
Okay, so the people who were originally Democrat with softer opinions got stronger opinions over time.
Yes.
Okay.
And then in response, the right moved right.
Okay.
So people will argue this, but this is from Pew, which is reasonably neutral even still.
So is centrism not a thing at all in the US?
Yes, it's not a thing anymore.
Okay.
In my view. And I can show graph after graph on that. Basically, the tribes have pulled apart.
We see extremity in India when it comes to pro-Modi and anti-Modi, where anti-Modi people will call him a dictator and pro-Modi will call him a god. But we have a good amount of centrists as well. But this is a stark difference that I see between America and India.
Yeah. So here's, for example, this is a graph that shows in 1950, people in Congress tended, whatever their party, to tend to vote together. By 2011, it was fully partisan. Democrats voted Democrats, Republicans voted Republicans. And this is not a short-term trend, it's a 70-year trend of almost like cell division.
You'll have to explain what this graph is.
What is this graph?
Geographic? Is it like...
Yeah, it's a network graph, right? So it's a graph that basically, what is it depicting? The nodes here, each node represents a congressman, okay? And they're colored blue if they're Democrat and red if they're Republican. And there's an edge between congressmen if they voted yes or no together on the same bill. Okay, so you can see lots of bipartisan bills were passed back then, right?
It's a representation of their opinions, and some of them were still kind of centrist in their approach towards politics.
And they voted with each other across parties. It wasn't as polarized as it's become.
Gotcha.
But gradually over time, you can start to see almost like cell division, like mitosis. Gradually, you can start to see the parties pull apart. You see this, right? Until by, for example, 1995, you start getting party line votes. I mean, it's something where Democrats and Republicans are both doing this, right? So now you have cell division.
Wow.
Right?
Basically, they're mostly stopping listening to the other side and just going with what they believe.
Correct. And the thing about this is literally what mitosis looks like. You have a cell.
Damn.
And it divides in two.
So effectively, when policy is being discussed in the American government, at this point, all the Republicans stay with their own opinions and all the Democrats stay with their own opinions, and they're not willing to listen to the other side.
That's right. And this is what happens at you take the body and you zoom in, and here's a cell, and it goes through a series of phases and eventually divides in two, right? So for the body, so too for the body politic.
Gotcha.
Right? If you think of, we're made of cells, but a country is made of people. It's like one level up. It's a meta-organism, right? There's now a process of literal cell division that's happening. And this was at the leadership level that I showed you over here. But now here, it's at the level of people. This is a totally different data set.
Explain this graph.
So this is showing Twitter nodes. So these are Twitter accounts, okay? And what's colored in blue are Democrat accounts that have declared themselves Democrat. You know, they tweeted support for, this is from 7 years ago, by the way.
These are all media accounts, right?
No, just normal people.
Oh, okay.
The big ones there are big follower accounts that are mostly followed by blue or red, respectively.
Wow.
Okay.
Gotcha.
But basically, what this showed is by 2016, 2017, reds followed reds and blues followed blues.
And the green ones are?
The green was the rare neutral kind of Switzerland at the time. The Hill was like one of the very few outlets that both sides tended to cite, right? Because it gave relatively neutral political news. So-and-so was nominated, so-and-so, you know, election results, stuff like that. That was considered uncontroversial then. But this was actually 7 years ago. You know, what's happened since then is it's actually, let me pull up this chart. It's actually really gotten even more polarized because now they're not just like, you know, in different parts of the same network. They're in different social networks.
Okay.
Okay, by 2024, blues are in Blue Sky and Mastodon and Threads, and reds are in X, and they're also in Gab and Truth Social, and so, okay? So we have digital separation already that's taken place. And this is something which, you know, it's like North Korea and South Korea.
This is the tech manifestation of echo chambers.
Well, it's not, it is echo chambers, but it's actually even more than that. It precedes, in my view, it precedes partition. There's going to be some very messy, and I can show graph after graph, chart after chart on this. For example, for almost 15 years ago, right, there's a book called The Big Sort, right? Why the clustering of like-minded Americans is tearing us apart. Mm-hmm. Okay. And essentially was making the point that people were starting to ideologically sort to be near people who share their values. And in particular, blue states have an out-migration. They're losing, for example, here, let me zoom in on this. The ones that are in red are losing people, and the ones that are in yellow are gaining. And the really big numbers, for example, let me see, you know, state to state migration, right? In general, people are tending, let me see if I can find a good, okay, here we are. Mm-hmm. So this shows, for example, in 2022, California lost more than 343,000 people, and Florida gained almost the same number. Florida and Texas are winning. California and New York are losing. Okay, so basically the blue-controlled states, people are voting with their feet against blue governance for red states.
Okay, hold on. So the color represents the political ideology.
Correct.
And the number represents the migration of human beings.
That's right. So Democrats run blue states and Republicans run red states at the governor level and so on and so forth.
Effectively, Americans are moving into Republican-run states.
So Americans, yeah, well, so that's right. Some Americans are, on balance, if Americans move between states, they move from blue America to red America. So red America is sort of winning that migration thing. And in fact, actually, if you look at U.S. state population over time, this has always been a really good, there's a great video here. So this is basically starting all the way back when it was, when these were like literally colonies with a few thousand people.
Right.
Right? And so in the 1600s,
Damn.
big states.
This is like from, okay, go on.
It's really cool, right? It's a cool video. This is also another way of thinking about the emergence of what new countries will look like. I'll come back to that point. But so you can see these started with very modest populations. The United States was started like a startup.
Right.
With a few thousand people, right? This is less than like one village in India or something like that if you add all of this up, okay? And so it is possible to start new countries. Other human beings have done it. This is a theme we'll come back to. Anyway, so at the beginning, you know, before the United States was even the United States, this is still before 1776, Massachusetts, Virginia, Maryland, it was like the, you know, eastern seaboard that were this is like the Northeast.
This is Europeans moving in.
Europeans coming there, exactly, that's right. So Virginia is like this big state around this time, right? And if we skip forward, we start to see southern states, you know, like starting to get a little more populated. Mm-hmm. And right around here is boom, that is now American independence, right? And so when you go and you read about where things were done during American independence, you'll read about, for example, Pennsylvania was big at that time. New York was also big all the way back then. Virginia was like a really leading thing back then. It's not really right now, not in the same way. It's next to DC, but it's not thought of as a thing in its own right in the same way. And so you look at this and you see, oh, wow, Ohio is really rising. And for example, in the 1800s, Ohio was called father of presidents because there are like 7 presidents that came from Ohio. And this is now considered like the Rust Belt part of America where it's down on its luck, right? But back then it was rising, and look at how Illinois rises. So these are now in the center of the country, right? Missouri rises. This is now is the cowboy era. They're moving out west. This is the Civil War time right now, 1865. And by the way, this is not completely continuous data. What's happening is they're taking the survey from every 10 years. Now see how Texas comes up? Okay. So what happens is in the late 1800s, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, still most of the weight of the U.S. as you think about it is in the upper right corner of where the U.S. is, right? By the 1900s, you finally get, okay, boom, there's California, right? And notice that Florida isn't even over here in this discussion yet, right? It's not on the top, 10 or 15 most populated states yet. Now the Great Depression, that's when California really goes bananas because all these people move out west to get their fortune, right? And now see how big a deal California becomes. In a few years, it becomes the most populous state by mid decade or century. And so now it's California, New York, Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania starts declining, and when it declines like this, by the way, it just means it's less hot. People think about it less. Now see how Florida is rising, right? So in a sense, America is not just about elections, it's about migrations, right? So this is the time period I grew up in: California, Texas, New York, Florida. And these are still maybe the 4 most important states. But look at how Florida and Texas are gaining on, California and New York. And now it gets into like extrapolation territory around here, right?
Damn.
But basically, so that's like 400 years of history, right? And showing how population shift and how certain regions gain and fall and so on and so forth.
It's just the nature of America.
Yes, but it's another lens besides the elections. People talk about who's elected and who's politically in power, and that's important, but the migrations are on par with the elections in terms of understanding where people are moving to. If they have a choice, where are they going? They're going to where the jobs are. They're going to where the money is, where the excitement is. When the gold rush was happening, it was California. When the Silicon Valley was happening, it was California. Now that San Francisco and California are, in many people's views, so poorly managed, many are going to Florida and Texas. So that's what's driving that now, right? In previous times, in the 1800s, it was the industrialization of the Rust Belt, today's Rust Belt, but back then it was a booming area. Ohio and Michigan and Illinois, it drew people in. So right now, the problem is to download. As I said, this is like a serial where you're tuning on an episode 973, right? To figure out where to start with U.S. politics in 2024 is challenging. But go ahead.
Can we begin with a little context on Obama?
Please. Yes, sure.
Over to you. Like, how do the Republicans look at Obama's tenure and how do the Democrats look at it?
Republicans are just negative on everything Obama related and everything Democrat related at this point.
They think he wrecked the country a little bit.
Yeah, well, because the thing is, in his second term, a lot of people believe that in 2012, Obama didn't have a strong economic record to run on yet. And arguably, frankly, the entire economy of the U.S. is fake because of all the money printing, but I'll come back to that point. So in 2012, the campaign was run not on economics, but on race and gender and this kind of stuff. And so essentially a bunch of Democrat partisans were fired up with rhetoric about how the country is racist and sexist and, so on and so forth. And so wokeness exploded. And you can see this, for example.
It made its way to urban societies all over the world as well.
Oh my God. Yeah. So look at this. See, for example, here, word signifying prejudice, right? Basically flat. And then right in 2012, whoop, they went vertical like this.
Okay. What would be a word representing prejudice?
Racist, sexist, homophobic, all this kind of stuff, right?
People getting offended easily about things they were not offended about 10 years prior.
Correct. Exactly, right? And my thesis on why this happened is because of something that most people don't think about, which is technology is upstream. It's the hidden actor behind a lot of this stuff, okay? Because massive technological shifts have been happening. And what happened in the late 2000s is, this is a blurry, we'll give you, we'll do a better version of it in the thing. What happened in the late 2000s, this was US media newspaper advertising revenue, okay? 67 billion at the top there, right? Then what happened was, after the financial crisis, it just crashed all the way down to 16 billion. Imagine coming from this to this in about 10 years.
What happened to all that money?
It went to Google and Facebook.
Okay.
So the internet wasn't even, to understand what the internet was in the US, it was just considered, first computers in the 80s, and then there was internet stuff in the 90s. But after the dot-com bubble in the year 2000, the mainstream US wrote off the internet for basically the 2000s. When I was in my 20s in the 2000s, it was about Iraq and the war on terror, but the internet was sort of bubbling below the surface, and Google was scaling and so on. But even by the year 2008, technology was not considered. This is very important to understand how recent this entire period is. By the year 2008, technology was not considered a source of power in the US. There was an article from that time that was listing the power centers of the US, and they listed Wall Street and the Pentagon and Madison Avenue and Hollywood and so on and so forth. It did not list Silicon Valley. In 2008, 2009, Silicon Valley was still thought of as it's like you buy a toaster, you buy a computer, and you might have a nice toaster, you might have a nice car, but you don't think of that as where power is situated.
Because
right?
it didn't affect votes back then.
It didn't affect votes back then. And also people just weren't online that much, right? But what happened after the year 2008, a lot of things went into turbo. First, the iPhone came out in 2007 and went vertical, then smartphones went. Second, Facebook really hit escape velocity, and in 2007 rose to hundreds of millions of users. Third, because of the financial crash, all kinds of people were looking to tighten their belts and get more efficient advertising dollars. So tens of billions of dollars in classifieds and advertising revenue went over to tech. What this did is it destroyed the livelihoods of a good chunk of people on the East Coast seaboard. They had been used to having expense accounts and writing 10 articles a year and traveling and so on and so forth. It was a really fun life, right? And now suddenly they're laid off, or their paper is bankrupt. All these local papers went bust. And who's doing well? The tech guys, right? Now, the thing is, tech was considered, from 2008 up until 2012, tech was just considered another wing of the Democrat Party. Like, if, for example, the very last bit of this was November 2012, right? When technology and internet companies helped Obama get reelected, right? When the nerds go marching in, how a dream team of engineers from Facebook, Twitter, and Google built the software that drove Barack Obama's reelection, okay? So as late as November 2012, tech was considered just part of the Democrat Party, and good, because free speech, all that kind of stuff, it was considered something that was just helping the blue team. But after the election, all of these journalists who had just been bankrupted, because this happened real fast, right? This happened over basically 4 years, right? All these journalists were like, you know what? Let's reassess our relationship with these tech guys now that the election is over, and we've got 4 years. We're going to settle some scores with the tech guys. So that's when the knives came out. And so, for example, in 2012, Gizmodo would write articles like, there's no such thing as a programmer.
What is that?
Meaning there's no such thing as like a tech bro. Okay. Like that's to say, you can't attack tech guys for being too masculine or being too chauvinistic. That doesn't exist. That's just ludicrous, et cetera, right?
Is this a response to the feminism wave rising?
Some of it was starting in 2012 under Obama's re-election campaign, right?
All this matters to the rest of the world as well, because American culture affects world culture.
Absolutely. And I'm going to show you that, right? So by 2013, just a year later, would you look at all these rich people and they started going after tech guys as rich, right? They started attacking them like politicians because they wanted to settle a score. And the other thing that happened was the New York Times company, and they're a company, by the way, they're not a nonprofit, they're owned by a family called the Oxelsbergers, right? You want to, actually, here's a question, okay? Just close your eyes. Can you visualize Mark Zuckerberg's face?
Yeah.
Okay. You know what he looks like? He's CEO of Facebook, founder of Facebook. Love him or hate him, he's out there taking the hit. Son of a dentist, became, a billionaire and so on. Okay. Now, Who owns the New York Times? Don't know, right? So this is a man, I'll show you who he is in a second, but this is a man who's surrounded by 1,000 journalists at all times. You've never read an article on him. You don't even know what his face is. You don't know his name. You probably hadn't even thought about that person as a person before, despite the fact that the New York Times is certainly as powerful an entity in some ways as Facebook or what have you, right? So here's why. It's this guy, and basically the New York Times company is just passed down from father to son. It's passed down 5 generations like this. Now, the reason this is hilarious and important is for a decade, as I'll show you, all of the New York Times journalists, all these people attacked largely Indian, Chinese, Korean, largely Asian tech populations as being white, male, privileged, blah, 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 when they were actually the privileged white males. Okay? So they were misrepresenting the reality of the situation, which looks like this. But for example, if you look at this graph, I'm not saying, I don't believe white is an insult, but tech journalists do. And if you look, the tech companies are actually significantly more non-white than the tech journalists are, right? Point is, though, that essentially all of this stuff, if you look at the graphs, all of the stuff on wokeism, right? This is like a key thing. So this is New York Times word usage frequency, 1970 to 2018, right? You see how certain things like mansplaining, toxic masculinity, male, they'll just go vertical like this. Okay, there's a comparison over here where something like Amazon or China, that's like a more organic trend. Right? This is driven by editorial judgment.
Wow.
Okay, so they just started dumping certain words into the new, basically it's literally like putting it in the water supply. They're putting it in the news feed, right? Why? Why are they putting these words in the news feed? Well, they're shocking, polarizing, agitating words that get them traffic. And why do they need traffic? Because if you look at their stock price, they had gotten crushed up to here, and they started putting these extremely inflammatory words in there, and their traffic started to come back up. And the big thing for them was in 2016, when Trump got elected, there was something called the Trump bump, and their stock price zoomed as they defended democracy against the next Hitler.
Holy shit.
Okay, so once you see this whole thing is actually a reality TV show, okay, where the New York Times is like upstream of all of this stuff, and this guy who owns the New York Times needed to make money, and so he decided to change the narrative, to change the script, because they're like the chief screenwriters of the whole thing. This is the thing that people don't get is out of 1 million things that you can put on the front page, there's 8 billion people in the world. There's so many different things you can put on the front page, so many adjectives you can pick. Just think about your own feed and how you think about, who you have as all this stuff, right? There's obviously a lot of editorial judgment that goes into that. And that judgment, even that makes the news, right? The words that you append to that, which news articles you select, you can tell a completely different story by picking 10 of these versus 10 of these, right? You can have a totally different worldview, right? And so once you understand this aspect of it, that basically because tech had disrupted them, because it had taken away their money, they were desperate for money. And how did they make money? By essentially going to yellow journalism.
What does that mean?
Yellow journalism means non-neutral journalism, slander, libel, demagoguery, and so on and so forth.
Because everybody loves a fight.
Yeah, and the same reason Obama needed power. So Obama needed power, the New York Times needed money, and that's how you get wokeness. And you can see it go. It's not an organic thing. You can see from these graphs, the New York Times word usage frequency, I'll give all these graphs as references. You can see it just go vertical like that. This is not something that's an organic phenomenon, right? Now, you know what's funny? Once they regained control in 2020.
When Biden got elected.
Once Biden got elected, they stopped saying Black Lives Matter, et cetera, because they didn't need to cause the riots anymore. Now they're back in control, right? See, I have a decent intuition on some of these things. And I was like, my senses has dropped off a bit. And so look at that. Right after 2020, boom, guess what? Racism solved.
They're not using these words in the articles.
Exactly. Right? Because they don't want to cause trouble. Now they're back in power, right? So like the level of cynicism here is on another level, like literally causing billions of dollars in riots and having people all fight each other just to boost their stock price for a few $1 million or to win an election, right? It is demagoguery. Think about sugar, okay? If people are just systematically adding sugar to every single meal, you're going to get more inflammation. You're going to gain weight, right? It's hard to avoid it. It's in everything, right? And you as a human being can only avoid these things so much. Eventually you're going to have a cookie at a friend's house, or you'll have some, like soup and it'll have sugar in it and so on and so forth. It's like if it's dumped into the water supply, it's hard to avoid it. And it's certainly hard for your friends to avoid it. So what they did is they dumped all these words into the water supply, into the media diet, and enraged people on purpose.
So this is a graph of the New York Times?
Yes.
Is there like a reverse graph of Fox News?
Interesting question. Fox reacts rather than acts. That is to say, the left acts and the right reacts.
Really?
Yeah. It's like,
I'd say this about both sides. And I have friends from both sides in America.
Right. But basically, like, for example, here, the left acts and goes left, and then the right reacts.
Gotcha.
Because the right is usually okay with the status quo, and left wants to change the world. So what I just did is I had some graphs that bring us to the present day. Just to recap, we're seeing a 70-year trend of social and political separation. We saw basically a 1, 2, 3, 4 cascade of events where technology rose, it bankrupted mainstream media, they got desperate and they needed money. Similarly, Obama in 2012 didn't have a great economic case, so he needed power. Together, basically, they just filled the airwaves with wokeness, which is a totally inorganic phenomenon. It was manufactured at that time. And that caused massive negative energy. And this, in turn, brought us to the rise of Trump, starting in 2015. So the thing to understand about Trump, in my view, again, is that to zoom back 1 second, Twitter elected Trump. Twitter actually also elected Prime Minister Modi and Bolsonaro and Orban and a bunch of other. Twitter led to Brexit, right? Twitter essentially, because it allowed a leader to speak unmediated to their followers, was a absolute game changer. And in a sense, that's still being underestimated because the internet allowed new kinds of people to be elected. See, in the US and some other countries, there'd be in the rhetoric about, oh, you have freedom of speech and so on. When I grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, people would say that. But you didn't actually have practical freedom of speech until really the early 2010s. You know why?
Because Facebook and Twitter became a thing.
Yes. And in particular, in the 80s, the 90s, the 70s, 60s, you need a radio license, you need a TV license, right? You needed to inherit a fortune to run a newspaper. You needed trucks, you needed trees, all this type of stuff. That was why people said, never argue with a man who buys ink by the barrel. Have you heard that, right? Because it meant, no matter what you say, they've got more distribution than you do. They buy ink by the barrel, meaning whatever version of their argument, you're never going to win it, right? And that's how powerful the news media was at that time. They would frame the question and they were basically upstream of things. And what happened was the guys who set up that system understood that they were giving a right that didn't actually mean anything in practice. Sure, you have freedom of speech. You can talk to your neighbor, but they have a broadcast antenna and they can broadcast to 1 million people. So it doesn't matter what you say, right? But over time, what happened was everybody, have you seen those movies where there's like a mummy in a sarcophagus?
What's a sarcophagus?
Sarcophagus. There's something that's like trapped and people forgot why it was trapped. It's in a dusty tomb, right? And they go and the explorers go and they dust it off and they're like, what's in here? This looks cool. Oh, it says don't go in. That sounds interesting, right? And they knock it off and the thing comes out, right? That their ancestors sealed up for many years. So in the same way, true freedom of speech had actually been sealed up and bottled up for many, many, many years. And it was let out bursting forward, right? Because in the 20th century, it was a century of communism and fascism, but also even democracy in the US had heavy censorship. It was less bad than the other two, but it was heavy, especially relative to the 1800s. Now, because you had, for example, mass media and mass production, there's all these choke points. You couldn't just roll off a newspaper and, go and do something with it. It was actually hard to get something distributed. So now that anybody could just set up and stream a show and become popular. Anybody can connect to anybody. It massively disrupted them also from a power standpoint, not just a money standpoint, right? So what the internet has done is it's basically destabilized the conditions under which the post-war order, one way of thinking about it is it's the pre-internet order. Okay, 1945 to 2020 will be like this call to time. And then I think 2021 or 2020 is the year that we became an internet-first global civilization. Everything happens on the internet first. Example, we'll talk on the internet and then we'll meet in person, right? You'll shop on the internet and you'll hit a button, it gets delivered, right? You will decide to go somewhere, you hit a button and the car comes, right? Everything happens internet first. And if it's really important, it gets printed out into the physical world. Bring this back to our earlier point. You know what else is happening internet first?
What?
The separation. And that's going to get printed out in the physical world too.
Mm-hmm. You're saying that maybe geographically you're in the same country, but emotionally, mentally, psychologically, you're in two different countries.
Correct. Exactly. And just to show you what that looks like.
And while you speak about America, this is going to be the condition of the rest of the world within the next 5 to 10 years.
So yes, it's actually already the condition of much of the world, but there's some very important exceptions, right? Essentially, the farther India is in this really interesting balancing point, which is why I'm actually here and talking about this. Because India is in BRICS and SCO, but it's also in Quad and, so on and so forth, right? So it's a bridge between the worlds, right? So let me just to show you why this is so interesting, these digital maps. This is the map of the US in 1861, okay, right before the Civil War. And this was the North and this was the South, okay, the Union and states, okay? And they were not just physically separated, not just ideologically separated, but physically separated. They didn't just have different beliefs. There's also a clear border between the two because of how the policy had led to the ideological difference. And so the victory condition when one fought the other one was very clear. You invade them, you get to their capital, you beat them, you raise a flag, and they stop fighting, right? Have you ever heard the saying, war is politics by other means? No? Okay. Clausewitz, war is politics by other means. You know what that means?
That if you can't force your policy into like the other side, go attack. That's
part of it. The other part of it is, so you know how there's a defense department and also a diplomacy department? Most countries have both, right? One way of thinking about it is in a war, you punch with one fist and you offer a treaty for them to sign with the other. Okay, that's what war is.
Yeah.
Okay, for example, at the end of World War II, the whole point of the atomic bombing was to get them to sign on the line that was dotted. It was the whole point, unconditional surrender, right? Like literally, it's most people don't realize this, that actually war is kind of like a corporate negotiation in a sense, right? Punch. Are you ready to sign now? No? Okay. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, fine. Now you're going to sign, right? And that's actually why in a functional country that wants to end a war, you need to actually have some party on the other side that controls their own forces enough that they can sign something. So when I say war is politics by other means, why did I bring that up? Basically, these guys couldn't get them to stop the policies they wanted. So they went down, punch until they signed, right? And the issue is that in today's America, it looks fractal, right? So it's not all in. Go ahead.
It's not north and south. It's basically
urban and rural, roughly, right? And there's lots of blue and red and blue. So you couldn't use an atomic bomb. You couldn't use area effect weapons because you're going to kill a bunch of the guys on your side as well. So the talk of civil war and so on and so forth isn't exactly right. But here's the thing, even though red and blue are not separated in physical space that much, you know they are separated? Digital space. So this is a battlefront that looks like this,
right?
Except in digital space. And the thing about it is, once you understand this as a social war, if in a physical war you have to invade the enemy's lands, do you know how you win a social war? You have to invade the enemy's minds, because you can't go house to house everywhere here. You have to install software in their head such that red becomes blue or blue becomes red. So now you see why the emphasis on language, why you need to put your pronouns in your profile, right? Why they want to cancel you and take you off of social media, why they want to deplatform, and so on and so forth. All of that is basically blue moving into red territory or red moving into blue territory. When, for example, Peter Thiel bankrupted Gawker, that was like taking out a blue battleship. It's actually relatively infrequent. Red was actually much weaker. Most of the time it was going the other way. Blue was canceling red. Once you see it as a battleground and these people being essentially soldiers, right? You realize, okay, that's the only way that you can pacify a population. You can't invade, you can't shoot, or at least it's very hard. But what you can try is information war to try to flip them. If you could somehow flip them all to blue or flip them all to red, fight's over.
Gotcha. I'm with you on this.
Yes.
I'm trying to simplify it through words.
Go. Sure.
Effectively, when we speak about hot war, like actual war between countries, the narrative is that the future of war is cyber. Like everything happens through software, hackers, drones, etc. But when we're talking about civil war, it's not necessary that civil war will also be all about physical violence. Civil war in the modern context, especially, is about psychological violence that takes place on social media and on your phones.
So once you understand that the US is actually in a state of, we call it digital civil war, social war, and has been for about 10 years, right? Trump was like the first wartime general on the Republican side, right? Think of, from the Republican standpoint, they were just getting beat up constantly by Democrats, right? And what I mean by that is, just to level set on this, this is the only two that donate to Reds. Most U.S. institutions are now blue, right? And that includes like things you might think of normally as conservative, like the U.S. Navy or the U.S. military, okay?
But why does the US Navy donate in the first place?
It's individual soldiers from the Navy that donate, and they put their professional affiliation on where they're on. It's required to disclose your employer when you donate, right?
I also saw Amazon in that.
Yes.
So
Amazon
you're saying
is very blue.
now? So is that Amazon as an organization?
Yes.
All the employees.
It's employees.
Okay.
Yes. So this is the best bet we have to see, because you have poll data necessarily internally on companies, right?
Wow.
But essentially so institutions are blue, right? The best you can get is like slightly centrist, okay? NYPD and the Marines are tiny over here. They don't have much cash, but what they gave to Trump, right? Now, here is money, okay? Blue counties hold 71% of GDP and reds hold 29%.
Right.
Okay. In academia, Democrats vastly outnumber Republicans. I'll show you actually this one as well.
It actually seems like the blue side has all the muscle.
It has massive, massive dominance. So here, this shows almost 100% of communications profs are Democrats, 100%. And you have to get engineering, you get down to like 61%. What's interesting is the harder the science is, the closer it gets to 50-50. But the softer the science, the more political it is, the more Democrat it is.
Wow. Okay.
Right? So, and then if you go and look at journalism, media is also blue, 95.5. Okay. So this, and then to show you one more thing, and this is very important.
But then how did Trump get elected in the first place?
It's great, because he had Twitter. And so Twitter was not something that, remember, in 2012, the establishment was still thinking technology was on the side of Democrats, right? So they did not think, what basically happened was, what is your vision of, or if you were to visualize a Trump voter, okay? You'd probably visualize somebody in a trucker hat, like working class or something like that. That's like your typical, almost stereotypical Trump voter, right? So now here's the thing. That, if you go back further in time, and you may be too young to remember this, in the 80s when I was growing up, Republicans were actually thought of as wearing suits and ties, right? And being upper class. Okay. So how did that change? How did it go from like the suit and tie wearing Republicans of the 80s to like the proletarians of the Trump era, right? I have another explanation that I think is important. So this is a graph that's a little sophisticated. I'll show you the animation version. Okay, let me explain what you're seeing here. Each dot there is a Democrat county or Republican county. This is their GDP. So these are like rich counties with 90 billion GDP, and these are poor counties. The blue outline shows what things were in 2008. So in 2008, that was the Democrat distribution, and this red outline is the Republican distribution. If you look, the Republican and Democrat distributions look like they're roughly the same, the square outline in 2008. But by 2018, all of the wealthiest districts had somehow turned Democrat. In 10 years, you have to go to like the 23rd or something richest district to find the first Republican district. And the median is like something like 50 billion GDP for a Democrat district and like 30 billion for a Republican district.
Okay? Effectively, does it mean that the richer people in America are on the side of the Democrats?
Yes, but it also means Republicans and Democrats were roughly equal in 2008, and suddenly Democrats became very wealthy relative to Republicans by 2018. Why would that happen? Well, suppose that there were, so you know how shares work in a company, right? Suppose there were 10 shares in a company and you had 1 share. You own 10% of the company. Then the company issued 90 more shares and gave you 1. Your number of shares would go up. Yay, you've gone from 1 to 2 shares. But your percentage ownership would go down because at the beginning you had 1 over 10 and now you have 2 out of 100. So you went from 10% ownership to 2% ownership. Even as you seem to get richer, you actually got poorer. This is how inflation works. The US government prints money, you get some of it, and it seems like you're making more money, but you're actually getting poorer. Okay? It's meant to trick you. It's like there's this famous poem, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Have you heard that? Yeah. Right? Because you're in the ocean and it's salt water. So there's all this water, but I'm thirsty somehow, right? So printer everywhere, but no money for anything. Okay, all this money is being printed, printer everywhere, but no money for everything. How do I have all this money, but I'm still so poor? Like the cost of living is rising. Okay, so what happened was in the 2008 financial crisis, there was something called quantitative easing. Oh. Gigantic amounts of money was printed by the Federal Reserve of the USA. Okay.
And this has a lot of geopolitical significance as well.
Massive. Like literally unprecedented amounts of money was printed. Look at this vertical kind of jump like this. And you can, okay.
Who decides these rules?
The
Who
Fed.
decides how much money you're allowed to print?
The Fed.
But what about for other countries?
Good question. So most other countries, so this is an important thing. Here is what you think this is what people think the map of the world is. Mm-hmm. Okay. And all of these are independent countries in theory. But it's not actually the real map of the world. And the reason is most of these are not independent countries. Most of these countries are so-called protectorates of another country, meaning they outsource their defense to them, right? So if you have a different map of the world, so this is U.S. military base abroad 2015. It's good enough for what it is now, right? Notice where those bases aren't. They're not in Russia. They're not in China. They have this thing there. I'm not sure what that is. Maybe that was Hong Kong or something, but and they're not in India, right? This is all the stuff related to Afghanistan or what have you, over here, right? So Russia, China, and India are like sovereign countries, and these Central Asian countries are kind of under Russia's umbrella, and these Eastern European countries also at the time didn't have U.S. military bases, and that's why this whole Ukraine thing was such a flashpoint, right? But everywhere else that has a U.S. military base is not actually an independent country. And if they're not an independent country, they can't set their own policies. So the actual true number of independent countries in the world, of course, there's a continuum, right?
I also have something to say. We had a lot of Indian military vets on the show. Mm-hmm. The one thing I know about war is that it's won or lost by logistics.
Yes.
So where a military base is placed on the world map says a lot about how that country looks at the world.
Yeah.
If we could go back to that map, they're obviously on one side of Europe, protecting all of Western Europe. They're on the edge of Western South America.
Well, all of this is because this was still when the Middle Eastern wars are raging.
Right.
So there's a lot of forced deployment over there.
Yeah. And I mean, right in the center of Africa, so you could go up and you could go down.
Yes.
Also in Australia. There is something you can tell even from the position of the military bases.
That's right.
But it kind of, at least to me, it looks like, hey, we're going to protect ourselves from China and Russia.
Well, so that wasn't a thing yet in 2015, right? in 2015, Russia and China were not yet demonized in the same way that they are now, or demonized. Let's call them. They weren't enemies and considered enemies in the same way. At the time, it was still the war on terror and so on and so forth.
You're saying that the positioning of the military bases says that these countries are basically parts of America anyway.
Exactly.
Okay.
They are American colonies or American protectorates, right? Protectorate is factual, but you call them colony or not, they're not. They're in the weird intermediate state where they're certainly not fully independent, but they're also not managed as a 51st state. So they're somewhere in the middle where the U.S. doesn't take full responsibility for them, but they're also not allowed to take full responsibility for themselves. They sort of dangle in this, right? That's how you have total chaos in Syria and Libya, lots of places like this. They just get blown up, and they're neither managed centrally nor are they allowed to manage themselves, right? That's a common pattern, but we can come back to that.
Modern day imperialism?
It's worse than that, because imperialism, at least there's some responsibility you're taking for. Worse than imperialism is you're not running it and you're not allowing them to run it. So no one's running it. It's just anarchy in the name of democracy. The question is who has control, right? Roughly speaking, you can say the US is an independent country, Russia's independent, China's independent. Now India's independent. You can argue Saudi's becoming independent, and Israel. This is complicated, and actually some of the Eastern European countries, Hungary, El Salvador, more and more countries are declaring independence from America.
By saying, hey, get your military base out of here.
Yeah, exactly. Or get your NGOs out of here.
That's the other one.
That's the other one, right? Because an important concept is sometimes the left and the right, often they fight, but sometimes they work together. Remember how I said Pentagon will punch you, and then state gives you something to sign, right? When the military and the diplomats are working together, that's how it works. It's like a negotiation. Punch. Are you ready to sign? Here's the thing. Okay, punch some more, right? So sometimes the warriors and the priests can collaborate. Okay, and a great example of that is so this is Afghanistan after the U.S. military withdrew. And you see on the wall the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then these guys with AKs just don't care about that at all. This is like religious literature that was left behind because, the wokes worship the state, right? And this would never be there without the warriors. The priests, Western priests, would never be able to put up this stuff. Because what are they talking about here? Sustainable development. They're like, just to zoom in on those. This is what being a good person is, right? It's like no poverty, no hunger, health and well-being, quality. Who could be against any of these things, right? Mm-hmm. They're all optimized for sounding good. Communism is also optimized for sounding good, right?
Isn't the UN irrelevant now? At least that's how it's perceived outside of
It's
America.
Becoming much less relevant. And the reason is BRICS is becoming a parallel UN.
Yeah.
And BRICS actually flipped G7. Did you see that?
Yeah.
Here.
The UN didn't do the job it was built to do. And it seems like from a geopolitical lens that the UN is just a tool in the hands of the American state.
It is. But the thing is that in 1945, the American state was so dominant that like anything that was happening in the world was going to be de facto them anyway, right? So this graph shows that BRICS like flipped G7 a few years ago. Okay. So anyway, put all this stuff together.
If people don't know what BRICS or G7 is, explain that as well.
Oh yeah. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and actually now a bunch of other countries that just joined BRICS. And it was actually an acronym that a Wall Street analyst came up with to just talk about emerging markets that actually became its own form. Someone took it seriously and turned it. The meme became real, right? G7, those are the group of 7 quote developed nations, and it's like the US, Canada, France, UK, Italy, Japan, and Germany, right? And actually, for a while, Russia was there in the G8, and then now they got kicked out after all the recent unpleasantness. In 2014, I think they got kicked out of that. So the thing is that the entire concept, by the way, of the developed world, we'll talk about that later, is itself a stolen base. because it says, oh, we're developed and you little brown people are developing towards us and we're at the end state of humanity and you will follow our lead. You'll follow the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But that's actually not what's happening at all. Now we have, instead of the developed world and developing world, we have the ascending world and the descending world, right? So India is ascending and Western Europe and Blue America are descending, right? Basically, the U.S. has been hit by the internet, right? It's also been hit by the China shock, and to a lesser extent, but growing, it'll be hit by an India shock in a different way. And in response, it's like a system that just has gone destabilized. It was built under a certain set of assumptions and has gone fundamentally destabilized. And so, for example, it assumed that there was just going to be money forever. This is like kicking the leg out from something, right? That's not just $15 billion. It's $50 billion that pays for all kinds of opinion shapers. When all these people lost their jobs, it's like a set of cascading dominoes. And we talked about how they started turning the tech guys. And so first tech went vertical. Then after the 2012 election, Democrats and journalists started attacking tech. And they also started just lashing out at everybody, in particular Republicans. And so in 2015, Trump basically came onto the scene. And because he had Twitter, he could just get his message out. And the internet elected Trump. And so after 2016, suddenly the journalists were even more angry at Facebook and Twitter and so on, because now they hadn't just taken their money, they had taken the political power by allowing Donald Trump to be elected.
So
right?
The higher ups at the big tech companies were Democrat at the time.
Yes.
But the
most of them still are.
The platform which they built out allowed anyone to use the platform.
Because it's a neutral platform, Republicans could win.
Gotcha.
That's really fundamentally what it is. In a fair fight, in at least in the current media environment, in a fair fight in the English language internet, the right wins. If it's not censored, if it's not deplatformed, if it's not downranked in an algorithm and so on, it will eventually surface facts, right? Let me show you this. Let me show you another graph of the sentiment. Facebook things, normally what they have this headline and they say it's a paranoid conspiracy theory, right? Now though, because we can analyze the data, we can actually see this to be true. Look at how negative the New York Times got on Facebook. They were positive. Remember I said they're positive in 2012? And then they just started turning negative here. And it's gradual, right? There's still some positivity here, but then starting especially here, they're just like, and just hammering Facebook all the time. You remember that, right? And so as a consequence of this, tech guys started to realize we just can't get a fair shake from these guys. They are not, see, there's a difference between constructive and destructive criticism. Constructive criticism is, here's this feature that I wanted to use and I'd like you to fix it or something like that. And eventually people at Facebook were like, they're trying to kill us, And why are they trying to do that? Okay, because they blame us for Trump, but they also are competitors with us and they blame us for taking away their money. Okay, and it's several things, right? The thing is, Silicon Valley is 3,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. So it's geographically far away. So you don't hang out all the time, number one. Number two is it's psychologically different. The kind of people who are in tech are more rational, logical, mathematical, quantitative, as opposed to verbal, emotional people and so on in the East Coast. At least not Wall Street, but certainly media. And then third, demographically, it's different. There's way more Asians in tech, way more immigrants, way more, non-Americans and so on. Whereas the Northeast is almost all, much less immigrant, right? Much more American and so on and so forth. Like old line American, but, they're the kinds of, many of them are like WASPs who will say that they hate white people so much or what have you, right? Like this kind of person. And so the geographic, psychological, and demographic differences are a genuine chasm. And one of the consequences is if someone was working at a media company and their media company went to zero and they didn't have a spouse who worked at Google, there wasn't any intra-household buffering. But if all of the elevators in your community go down and all these random Indians and Chinese suddenly get really rich on the other side of the country, not happy. Okay. And so, so this is the backdrop so there's essentially multiple conflicts happening. There is the establishment versus tech. There's establishment versus Trump. There's also now the establishment versus Russia and versus China, right? And to some extent, like you can argue whether they're on side or complicated with Israel. Also complicated even with India, right? It's a complicated relationship. It's not, and they also don't like Orban. They don't like Saudi. They don't like, basically Blue America is at war with tech, Trump, Russia, China, the Saudis, like, Viktor Orban, like so many different groups around the world at the same time, and with themselves because they have their own internal divisions of center left and far left, right? So I'll show you one more graph and then let's bring it back to the assassination, right? So this is showing the left and right spectrum in the US. And what it shows is
the extremes on both sides favor those countries.
Yeah, but the actual edges matter, right? So let's say there's 6 factions. For example, far left, center right, right, far right. Okay? So the center left, the left, and the center right favor Ukraine, but the right, far left, and far right favor Russia. On Israel-Palestine, it's reversed, where the center left, center right, and right favor Israel, but the far left and far right and left favor Palestine. So this one cleaves right into the heart of the ruling coalition. It genuinely divides people, right? Mm-hmm. There's more who are against it than for it in general within Democrats. Then this is hypothetical, but China-Taiwan would basically, people think who made this graphic that it'll land up like this. I'm not so sure. I think it might be just the center that supports Taiwan and the rest are just anti-war. They're not really for China or what have you.
How have they constructed this graph? Like where have they got the
data?
Yeah.
It's based on, I bet if you did go and survey a bunch of people, it would roughly come to this. It's one of those things where it is somebody's intuition of seeing thousands of tweets and what have you, right? Ukraine is much more of an internally splitting issue for the Republicans and Palestine more of an internally splitting issue for the Democrats. But the consequence of it is just these two, even these two aren't, this by the way is over here. It's like saying who's on the US side versus on the terrorist side, only the far, okay, right? So it's a kind of a joke, but it's also true there are extremists. Point though is, even if you just take the first two scissors here, right? The Ukraine and Palestine scissors, these are scissors. They take a coalition, they chop it in two, and then another one comes that chops in two again. And there's yet another one that just happened. So here, for example, here.
In 2021, there was just one faction. Whether far left or center left, you had the Democrats. By 2022, there was a scissor over Ukraine, where the far left backed Russia and the left and center left backed Ukraine. By 2023, there was a nastier split over Israel, where the far left and the left backed Palestinians and the center left backed Israel, and that was on top of the existing factional conflict over Ukraine. By 2024, the Democrats now were fighting over Biden, where the Bidenist and post-Bidenist factions have lined up. And on the Bidenist side, you have members of the current administration, as well as former presidents. And on the post-Bidenist side, you have congressmen, senators, governors, donors, and media corporations. And this doesn't exactly map to the existing ideological conflict. It's really a non-ideological conflict, a power struggle. If you take all these pieces together, you have a party divided. The Democrats are now in chaos.
Okay. So this was the biggest story up until like 3 days ago, right? It's not going to go away. And the reason is there's going to be some more video coming out of, Biden will keep generating videos of like not being able to complete a sentence.
Is
right?
the Republican side also this divided?
It was. They fought their own civil war in basically 2016 and 2020. Trump had to fight off a zillion different primary challengers in 2016. And then he also fought another primary for 2024 with DeSantis and others. But he's just reunified. He's just rebuilt. He essentially took over the party and rebuilt it in his image.
At the start of the podcast, we spoke about his pre-political career and how once Obama pissed him off, it set him off on fire.
Yeah.
So what happened pre-2016?
Oh, I mean, the thing is, Trump had not been taken seriously as a politician before 2016. Romney brought him on stage in 2012 for his endorsement, but Romney just probably thought of him as just another endorser. He didn't realize how strong Trump would become. Probably didn't realize how strong he would become, because he had run as sort of a joke candidacy for a long time. In many ways, there's two ways of looking at the world, more than two, but at least two, which are the great man theory of history, where a great man changes history, right? And then there's also like the tides of history view, where there's like impersonal forces that are larger than any of us, and people are just carried aloft on them. And what's interesting is, I think with Trump, it's both great man theory of history. Great man, by the way, doesn't mean good man. It means great, like in a sense, Stalin is a great man in that sense, a bad man, but a great man. So I'm not saying great man is good man here, but just great man in the sense of someone who affects the flow by their personality and their energy. This is actually the superposition of two things, because there was there was Twitter and there was technology, and that had basically offered an arbitrage opportunity that the Brexit guys also took, and that actually also Prime Minister Modi benefited from, and that Bukele of El Salvador benefited from. He used that. All of these smart politicians saw, wait a second, I can just do an end run around the media, and I can just broadcast directly to the people, and I can have true democracy. But that's what actually true democracy is. Social media, some people say, oh, social media is a threat to democracy. Social media is true democracy. You know why? Everybody's voting all the time on everything. They're upvoting, right? You have, in theory, total freedom of speech. Anybody can say anything. They form coalitions. They're debating every issue. It's like the ultimate democracy in a sense, right? And also in the sense of you to your followers is like, a direct communication to them. You're not, they call it the media because it mediates. So before, you had to go and speak to the New York Times or whatever, and they'd go and print, and they would distort your words however it made money for them, right? A noisy channel in the middle that can transpose your words, edit them, cut them in a way that suits the New York Times best, not you, right? And then your followers might get misled by that. And so the New York Times and the media was fundamentally in control of the whole situation because they could mediate the response. Disintermediating them and speaking around them and speaking directly was just not something they'd ever planned on. And that's why the reaction against Trump was so ferocious. It was really Trump versus the media. And now it's sort of decloaked, and it's admitted that media are Democrats and Democrats are media, that's, a thing. Media is still upstream of Democrats. You know why? Elected Democrats. Because much of the US political system is not just who's elected. Because if you're like Sulzberger, who we mentioned, and he's inherited a newspaper, he outlasts any election cycle. He can't be fired, right? If you're like Alexander Soros, who inherited Soros's fortune, he can't be fired. He runs these nonprofits and NGOs. He's not accountable to market or electoral forces, right? If you're a bureaucrat in the federal government of the US, you have tenure. You can't be fired. If you're a professor in academia, you have tenure. You can't be fired. So media, nonprofits, the bureaucracy, and academia all have people who can't be fired, who surround and ring the elected part of the state. And that's actually the real control plane. That's a permanent establishment that can't be fired, that has tenure, that's also invisible. It's actually a lot of people, so it's not like one person you can single out, right? So Trump decided to go against this. I don't think he fully understood what he was signing up for, right? And over the last 10 years, it's this, it's complicated. It's like, at this point, he's a historical figure. Like I would have said that even last week, but at this point, absolutely a historical figure in the sense of having absolutely no previous elected position to my knowledge, at least, right? Just coming in like a bull in a china shop and tweeting his positions, and got attacked from all sides in 2015, 2016. The thing that was really interesting was normally when a candidate says something that's like outside of the spectrum of what can be said, the media cancels him and then their campaign is just done and dead, right? Trump was the first person who could withstand that. And the reason he could withstand that is he had Twitter. So for example, there's one famous kind of encounter, I think, with John McCain or something, who tried to attack him in 2015. And he said something like that he liked the guys who didn't get captured, right? So the thing is, McCain himself, the old school American war hero was a war hero. He killed lots of the enemy and so on and so forth. McCain represented, or Kerry represented, a different kind of quote war hero, where Kerry protested the war, or McCain was captured and beaten up and so on. And so it was more of a victim than a traditional hero. So Trump, like with unerring political instincts, zeroed in on something that actually a big chunk of his base also agreed with, that, well, actually, you're right. A real hero is someone who's like Audie Murphy, who goes and shoots up the enemy, not someone who gets captured. But in a sort of like a real zinger kind of way. But it was too hot for normal, normal press. It's like too insulting. Oh my God, you're disrespecting our troops, blah, 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 blah. A lot of troops loved it, but it was, and because they didn't want McCain sending them to war and so on. That's the other aspect of it. Many people, many Republicans, many others were just dissatisfied with the level of, dissatisfied actually underestimates it. They were enraged at the fact that they had been reasonably well off and now were poor. Their jobs had been sent to China, for example. So they would think, or, after the financial crisis, other people got bailouts and they didn't. They went bust and they had to struggle, but guys on the news, did well.
I remember before he got elected as president, the one thing that used to reach us in India were his zingers about building the wall, between Mexico and America.
Yes.
And sending people back home. Things like that.
That's right.
So it was almost like a racist narrative that reached us.
Yes, for sure.
And what we're told now by a lot of Indian Americans is that the country has become more racist. That's another narrative that reaches India.
It has. So this is really complicated. The complicated thing is, I think what happened was the left called everybody racist and sexist long enough that, and they pushed things to such a far left extreme that they actually summoned into being that thing that they were attacking. Okay. Because what would happen is a moderate conservative, for example, let me give you an example. Mitt Romney said that, he had binders full of women for cabinet positions or something like that in the 2012 debate. Obviously, he's saying he's prepared to hire many qualified women and so on and so forth. But he was just attacked for that over and over again, as if he was some retrograde misogynist, blah, 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 hates women. And so what that did was essentially a lot of conservatives realized, wait a second, if they're going to be attacked as, racist, fascist, Hitler for asking for some immigration controls or saying binders full of women and they're just dragged as a sexist, what's going on there? Basically, you had to find folks who would not cancel you. And so essentially that's what led to this, right? That's what led to this. Basically, the left going left or first and the right afterwards, right? Mm. There's a meme that Elon likes on this as well. Like, in 2008, here's a conservative, my fellow liberal, me, right? My fellow liberal moving far, far to the left, right? And then woke progressive, bigot, me, and the conservatives like lol. Mm. Okay. And there is, so for example, once in a while, there's a hidden shift as revolutionizing American could transform the future of the Democratic Party. And let me show you some of these. Basically, many graphs show that for a long time, conservatives stayed the same. And so like Republicans were basically flat and Democrats rose like 30 points. Suddenly, oh my God, we need to continue. Like, did anything really change here? No, they just got different propaganda in my view, right? This went to 64 points in like 4 years, right? And
again, racism as a term was used much more,
right? This, by the way, after the first black president. What happened? It's this thing where a lot of Republicans found and conservatives found that they were going to be called racist and sexist no matter what they did. And then the only folks who'd accept them would be those people who actually were racist and sexist. That's like part of it. Okay. And they essentially, what we have now, for example, in the USA is the breakdown of the center where, let's take, for example, abortion. Okay. You have in the US today, you have both trans surgeries and hormones on kids that are below 18 and full abortion bans, as opposed to the sort of centrist position of safe, legal, and rare that Clinton had in the 90s, right? So you have both extremes happening at the same time. Some people might consider one of them reasonable or whatever, right? And maybe they don't even consider them extreme, or they consider them reasonable for their window. I'm not making any normative claim. I'm just observing that the center just got destroyed and split into two, right? I do think the left moved first, but now I think it's got a logic of its own, right? The right moves second, it reacts, but then it's now polarized enough, right? And I do think that the left in the U.S. the left in the U.S. got to the point that it's literally denying whether male and female exist. Okay, that's like basic stuff where you can see. I'm sure someone will get mad, whatever about this somewhere. Elon was very important on this. Just skip ahead for a second. By buying Twitter, he spent $44 billion and a good chunk of his own personal political capital energy to make it once again feasible to say in public, ask the question, what is a woman? That was like a year ago. Do you know that? June 2023, somebody put a documentary on Twitter asking that question, what is a woman, right?
These kind of situations are a circus for people outside of America.
For now, that's true. However, here's a caution. In the Soviet Union had the Red Terror and the total craziness in the 20s and 30s. When did China have its craziness? Well, the Cultural Revolution was like the 60s and 70s. So it's like somebody gets sick and then they get better and they pass the virus to you. Okay? So the mind virus could pass. This is one of the most important things that India has to be aware of, because it's getting fully integrated with this Western network, is to not bring the Western mind viruses home.
You see this with some urban Gen Zs in India.
Yeah. And the thing is, basically, now, here's the thing that will, I think, address this. The thing that is addressing this is it's lower status now to be doing this stuff than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. Much lower status. And I say, of course, something should be assessed on the merits, right? Whether it's true or false, not how much status it gives. However, it's undeniable that there's now, I can post video after video on this, but there's a lot of very high status people who have moved to the center right very publicly, right? Billionaires, tech founders, all these kinds of guys.
There's a huge section of American men who are looking at Trump as a savior.
Exactly. So this is the thing, is basically that clip, that's just like one of this guy posts a ton of these, right? There is, what's essentially happened is among men in particular. Okay. So I would say up until 2020, you could say Republicans were, quote, the white party, but now they've become the men's party. And that is actually different. At first it might seem like, obvious, but it's actually not. Let me show you some graphs on this, right? So basically the only group in the US that votes Democrat are unmarried women, but they do so by 37 points. Okay. So
when you say do so by 37, break that down.
It means 68 to 31.
Okay.
It's a huge margin for unmarried women. So married men, married women, and unmarried men all vote Republican. So it's not even like anti-women or something like that. Married women are favoring Republicans by 14 points. That's a lot, right? So the only demographic that votes Democrat are unmarried women, but they do so by so much. Okay? And this is like the people who watch The Handmaid's Tale and so on and so forth, right? And so there's this enormous gender gap that's open where women are on the left and men are on the right, that, like, in a sense, it's always been this way where Democrats have been, like yin and yang, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Yin is feminine and yang is masculine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Democrats have been the benevolent mother side of the government. It's going to hand out welfare. It's going to help you, right? And Republicans have like the stern father side of the government. It's going to blow up our enemies and it's basically safety and security. Okay. Safety is right? Protect our children and so on. And security is kill the enemy and so, right? And of course you do need some of both, right? That's yin and yang in balance. But now we've actually got something where in many Western countries, it's literally the women's party, or the unmarried women's party, I should say, and the men's party. Okay. And when I say the men's party, the reason that's actually really important is, so here's this article that got like, I think, almost 3 million views, right? So, and for text, that's a lot, right? So Republicans are becoming the men's party. So the obvious thing is Republicans have been attacked for decades as a party of rich straight white men. So of course they're the men's party. But this is actually non-obvious because it's a huge shift in emphasis. First, they're no longer the party of white men, but anti-white men. Very important phrase. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So I think we're both anti-white. That is to say, I don't want to attack a white guy on the basis of his race or something like that. That's stupid, right?
We like our white brothers.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what we're saying.
Exactly, that's right. You shouldn't be attacked on the basis of these characteristics, right? However, the thing is that once you say anti-white, that actually something clicks and you're like, but it's a big tent that does include non-white men as well, right? Okay. You just need to extend the common courtesy of not attacking white conservatives and libertarians on the basis of race, number one, right? Number two, it's not just the party of men because married men, married women, and single men all vote Republican. As of 2022, only single women vote Democrat. And, the spicy version of this is they're unmarried, but they're married to the state because that is actually taking the role of the protector and the provider. If they want someone to protect them, they have to whistle for the police to come. If they run low on money, they need the state to go and give money, right? So it actually stands in that role. So third, it's now the Republicans are now the party of strength. And just like Trump, like pumping his fist is like that, but it's also like Brian Johnson or it's, Eric Prince, who's like a military guy, right? Now, importantly, though, this is not like the multiracial working class party, not exactly, because they don't see themselves as victims and unionized and so on. They see themselves as masculine, which is different.
Get the
right?
job done.
Get the job done and so on, right? And the thing about masculinity is it's actually a much better thing to position around than white, non-white, because basically in any society, you're going to have a 50% baseline of men. And then you add to that with, let's say, married women. And now you're actually quite competitive. And on the other side are the people who are not strong men and don't respect masculinity. And, in general, the group that has strong organized men is usually going to win in the medium to long run. So I like the chances of a right that's repositioned like this. It's a major repositioning. It's very different than what it was for many years, right? Now, the other thing is the party of men, they're ultra libertarian in the sense of it's like guns, Bitcoin, like F the Fed, like, anti-lockdown, anti-institutional. There's much less emphasis on military service, much less trust in centralized authority, much more, Sigma male, right? Like the loner alpha, right? Than the company man, not a joiner alpha, loner alpha, very different, right? And so one thing that's interesting about this was my analysis, right? And then a few months later, what was interesting was to see after the conviction, right? He let's say the sentence. I forget exactly what step, but after there was I think the jury verdict, right? He appeared here at UFC, and it's a really interesting thing. That's a very important admission, and that for the New York Times in particular to make. After verdict, Trump revels in embrace of his most avid base. Male fans, okay? The party of men. But here's the important part about this. The crowd was diverse in every way, ethnicity, age, nationality, except gender. It was almost entirely male. Fathers and sons, men on their own, men in suits, men in shorts. The precious few women attending appeared to be on dates. They all seemed to like Mr. Trump. Think about this. Think about what an enormous concession and retreat this is for the Democrats. In 2020, all they said is Trump's a racist, Trump's a racist. And now we're seeing that's not just like one isolated video from TikTok. There is a lot of videos of Black men, Asian men, Hispanic men, men from all, Indian men from all walks that are pro-Trump because of masculinity and strength. Okay.
And also because they're anti-Biden.
Think of Biden as like a ventriloquist dummy where like people write something for the teleprompter and then he reads it off, right? And so he's actually, what's funny is Democrats will talk constantly about the dangers of dictatorship. And what they actually don't understand is leadership. And so they've gone so far in the opposite direction of leadership that they've implemented receivership. You know what receivership is? Receivership is when a company is not governed by its CEO. It's put into receivership, so it's governed by some outside body. It's like bankrupted, so it's in receivership. Okay? So That's what the Democrat Party is. It's headless because there's no one person in charge. Everybody feels they've got a slice of power.
Versus the Republicans,
which actually have a leader.
Trump's in charge.
Trump's in charge.
And all the other Republicans are in favor of him.
Well, he had to win a giant 10-year civil war for that, but yes.
At this point,
the Republican Party is definitely Trump's party. If you look at this over the arc of 10 years, just to calibrate, okay, the other day, see, it's a completely new experience for an elected Democrat to have the media just going after them to try to kill them. They're used to the media being on their side because the media is upstream of them and they push out their guy and, right? Here, so look at this. Jen O'Malley Dillon was candid about how difficult the fallout had been in the 2 weeks since the debate where Biden showed you, we've had 2 very, very hard weeks, very bad weeks. Biden's top political advisor has been saying in meetings, he's never seen a presidential candidate have more thrown at him than Joe Biden. You know what? I kind of think I've seen a candidate with a lot more thrown at him than Joe Biden got, right? And so if we can get through these 2 weeks, we can get through anything. So they are melting down and catching fire after 2 weeks of what Trump took for 10 years.
It's kind of trying to create sympathy, right? For Biden. Poor old guy. He's having a lot thrown at him.
Yeah, but exactly. But the point is, they're not, they're simply not used to all out opposition. They're not like real leaders. They're like cardboard paper mache propped up by an oligarchy, right? And actually, here's a visual of this. Because people talk about, oligarchy, regime, all this stuff or whatever, right? But I think a better way of thinking about it, a visual way of thinking about it, is the school of fish. This is you, and this is the Democrat Party. If you've seen the NPC meme, NPC means non-player characters, right? So all of them say the same thing in unison, right? We're all right. And so this is often used as an insult to attack Democrats. And it actually cuts for them. They don't like it because it does cut close since they're always looking for what did the experts say, right? They don't have onboard computation in the same way. Let me show you a concrete example of that. So
would call, probably the person I called most was the Secretary of Health and Human Services in Massachusetts. She worked for a Republican governor but when she was like, are you going to let them have professional and I was like, nope. And she's like, okay, neither are we. It was like conversations like that. So
that is how lockdowns happened. It wasn't science, right? This is how all decision-making is happening. You got a glimpse of how the school of fish operates. It's a peer-to-peer communication network. Are you doing that? Okay, I'm doing the same thing. And notice how they said it, right? They said, okay, I'm doing the same thing as you. Why did they do that? Because there's strength in numbers. You can't single out any one of them. If they're all saying the same thing together, like, for example, here's another example. In late 2020, right as the election was happening, there was a story on Hunter Biden's laptop. And essentially what happened was 51 former intelligence officials signed a document saying, we think this Hunter Biden laptop story is Russian disinformation. The Hunter Biden laptop had various kinds of stuff on payments to Ukraine and kickbacks for Joe Biden, which we'll probably, by the way, learn more about in the weeks or whatever to come. Point being, there's 51 of them. Do you know any of them, their names? No. To list them would be a whole thing. They had strength in numbers by doing it together. It's very difficult to punish any of them. Well, I thought he said this, that. Are you doing it? Me too, right? Okay. So this is actually the strategy. And when you see it, you're like, oh, okay. You're not up against Joe Biden. You're up against the school of fish, this hydra with many heads where no individual matters. What's funny is every individual is told that they matter. They are actually very proud of gaining their status, their position. Oh, I'm the Secretary of Transportation. They love their status more than anything else, right? In many ways, wokeism is like communism, but rather than redistribution of wealth, it's redistribution of status. Communism promised to redistribute wealth to workers and peasants. Wokeism promises to redistribute status to women and minorities by representation and recognition and the first, female this and the first, person of color that, right? It's very similar to how communism would promise all this stuff for the workers, and then the workers in the workers' paradise would end up in the gulag. Somehow, like with BLM, Black Lives Matter ended up burning down black businesses, right? And then nothing was said about it after the election. And in fact, lots of black people have now gone to Trump's category, right? So once you can see wokeism as the redistribution of status, all these people in the school of fish are doing it for the status. They get these positions. They can't do anything in them, but they get the positions. Another example of this is, do you see this like here? It's like, okay. So now, like by contrast, the old Secret Service, basically the before and after, this is what it was under Trump. Okay. And that's what it is now. And so these people, they just really like, they've seen these movies. I want to be a secret. I've dreamed of it since I was a little this and that. And so, and no one can say no to them. They just want the status of it, but they can't actually do the job, right? Basically, we saw with Mandy Cohen how she said, are you doing this? Okay, I'm doing this too. How the 51 intelligence officials all said it was a fake article about Hunter Biden, and so none of them could be singled out, none of them could be punished. And we saw how several of them, many of them, just care about maximizing their status. They don't care whether they can actually do the job, right? And so that is essentially how to think about the Democrat Party and the blue side. Is they're almost, all the talk about equality means they're against heroism. They're so against, quote, dictatorship that they're against leadership, and in fact for receivership. And that's what they've converted the party into. Biden is favored because he's weak, because he is essentially barely able to feed himself at this point, right? And so everybody can kind of do their own thing, and there's no boss to tell them what to do. And, they can loot the public blind while somebody else takes the public blame, which is Biden. There's hundreds of people running around the administration doing whatever the heck they want. And so that power that would be in the president is like sliced up and given to lots and lots and lots of people who are out of sight, out of mind, and you blame it on Biden. To state that the administration did something because Biden wanted it to do it. That's not what happened. There's some administration official that wanted it and then got Biden to read it off a teleprompter or something.
If you had to summarize Biden's 4 years of being a president to someone who doesn't understand American politics, how do you explain it?
It's the alternate universe where, I'm going to explain with an analogy that it's the alternate universe where the Soviet hardliners beat Gorbachev for a few years. Because Gorbachev was basically trying to change the system, and the Soviet hardliners launched a coup against him in 1991, and it failed, and the whole system came apart. Now, there's an alternate reality, so it's actually very similar. 1985, Gorbachev came. 1991 was the coup against Gorbachev. 2015, Trump came on scene. 6 years later was the counterattack against him. And so I feel we've gone through the alternate, dimensional portal where we're going through something that's like the fall of the USSR, but in my view, I don't know how long the USA has to go as in its current stance, right? As a 50-state union of Republicans and Democrats together. I think there's a lot of things, graph after graph, chart I can show. For example, Texas National Guard showing down with the Border Patrol, right?
I mean, I'm trying to understand it from an Indian political lens. Basically, the Indian government is gauged by the ease of doing business, the employment rate, GDP growth.
Right.
How would you describe Biden's 4 years?
Oh, disaster. But the thing is, it's not him. Let's call it the blue 4 years.
For example, if there was someone with a stronger personality running the country as the president, could they say no to listening to the rest of the Democratic Party?
So this is a very deep question, and it actually gets to, so let's say Biden is on the extreme end of being so weak that it's actually obvious to people, it's undeniable that he's not in charge. He can't even keep up the appearances of it. But a normal president like George W. Bush is also not in charge. George W. Bush was not in charge because, as I said, he's got the permanent bureaucracy, the permanent academia, the permanent media, and the permanent NGOs around him. And so whatever he does, they're going to outlast him. So they just say yes, 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 and then do whatever they want after he's gone, right? So what the journalists are very, agitated about Trump winning this time is they have various proposals in place to just retire all government officials. This comes from a guy, Curtis Yarvin, to basically just say the permanent executive is no longer permanent. Like supposedly all these government bureaucrats are employees of the president that should be able to be fired at will. And all of these conventions have grown up where they can't be fired at will, right? And so your question is, would a real man of action be able to do something? So the normal president for all the time that we've known them has been surrounded and crushed by this permanent bureaucracy. Biden is so weak that it makes it obvious that it's being steered by somebody else. But someone who's strong enough to actually steer it would be a change in the world order to a level that's hard to exactly imagine.
And that's what's expected from Trump now?
That's what he's claiming he's going to do this time. I mean, basically, it's kind of like you have some, kind of like Steve Jobs coming back, and after he had some time to clear his head and think about what he'd done wrong and build a team and so on and so forth. That's the most bullish vision on what he would do, right? I am however, very reticent / skeptical to think anybody can fix anything.
How were Trump's 4 years?
I mean, that's gosh, it's really hard for me. The problem is that the U.S. is just in a secular decline. And it accelerated under Biden, but there's a lot of money printing that was happening under Trump as well, right? There's a lot of wokeness, BLM, crazy things happening under Trump. It's hard for one man to stand against time in that way, right? And it's like, I think the best case outcome is something like Chiang Kai-shek getting Taiwan when China was overwhelmed by communism, or getting to like getting a red America that was functional, 20, 25 states, something like that. Let me explain what I mean by that, by the way. You see this? Texas National Guard blocking Border Patrol agents from accessing stretch their border in January. This is conflict between state level and federal armed forces. And it's not like a small conflict either, because it was like, I think it was like 25 Republican governors back Texas in escalating border dispute. And this was 26 January 2024, okay? Now, the governor of Texas was actually not in the U.S. at this time. You know where he was? He's launching a showdown with the federal government over border enforcement, as 25 other Republican governors back with him. He's doing a showdown with Joe Biden. So do you know where he was?
Where?
Day before Greg Abbott visiting India, okay? So he's doing a photo with the largest democracy in the world and 25 Republican governors when he's taking on Biden. What that means is blue America and red America have their own foreign policies. Okay?
Whoa.
Just like North Korea and South Korea have their own foreign policies, they've come apart. The mitosis thing I've talked about, right? These two photographs happened within a few weeks of each other. Newsom meeting Xi and Abbott meeting Modi. And by the way, that is the governor of America's largest Democrat state. And that's the governor of America's largest Republican state. Democrats and communists versus Republicans and Indians. That's how it's probably going to line up. And there's reasons for this where, in a sense, Republicans and Indians are arguably natural libertarians, like Jugad and, improvising things and so on. And Democrats and communists are both natural statists. They want state control over things, right? So it's statism versus libertarian, albeit these are Democrats and Republicans are the American version of statism and libertarianism, and communists and Indians are the Asian version of statism and libertarianism, but there's still a stylistic overlap there, right? Point being that, your question is an interesting one, which is, did they do a good job? Did they do a bad job? It's more like lots of things are heading down, and one group of people accelerated it, pushed it farther. And to just explain what I mean by that, let me just show you something. So look at this chart. This is U.S. interest payments, okay? For about 30 years, most of my adult life, the growth in the amount of interest that was owed each year was basically linear, okay? It went from about $300 billion here to about $600 billion by 2021. And now it's suddenly gone totally vertical like this. And if you drew two lines and you had this be y equals m1x plus b1, and this is y equals m2x plus b2, the ratio of the two slopes, like how much steeper this is 15x steeper than this. Okay? What that means is...
This is after Biden got elected?
This is after Biden. Okay? So what that means is now, there's stuff... The reason this happened, there's stuff that happened during Trump's tenure, like with the money printing during COVID, that helped lead to this as well. But Trump wasn't in charge of, or he nominated the guy who ran the Fed, but he just didn't have the political capital probably to totally clean house. He was fighting off all these impeachments, whatever, right?
To someone who doesn't understand banking and interest, what does this mean, U.S. interest payments?
It means your interest payments were high and now they're going through the absolute roof and they're becoming unaffordable. And it's more than, you're paying more in interest than you make in tax revenue each year soon. Okay. Like interest has now, as of I think this month, become the number one line item in the US budget. Just to show you, it's more than defense, it's more than everything else, right? So here's the other thing. When you're talking 15x, what that means is 7 years now is 105 years in the old world. You're seeing Interstellar when you're on a planet, right? And it's like 10 minutes here is like 10 hours back on Earth or something like that, right? So 7 years now is 105 years in the old world. They spent another American century in less than a few years. Do you see what I'm saying? They went into such ridiculous amounts of debt. And so this is like, you can visualize it's like a fizzing, this is dynamite that's just going to explode. It's going to blow up the world economy. It is going to cause something much worse than the 2008 financial crisis. And it is going to be something where really India and China will, and frankly, every the closer you were to America in the 20th century, the better off you were. And the farther you are from blue America, in particular in the 21st century, the better off you will be. Which is a total flip and inversion because they're the wealthiest and they'll go to the worst place to be in the world. And you can kind of see a preview of this where San Francisco has crazy addicts and syringes and poop on the streets of Needles, despite the fact that it's supposedly wealthy, right? And you have the BLM riots in all these blue areas, supposedly wealthy. It's all actually fake and it's going to blow up. So that's why I'm somewhat reticent to put the systemic failures here that have been accumulated over decades and generations on one man's head. Here's one other way of thinking about it, right? When you're in an office, okay, let's say you're in office for 4 years. It seems like a long time, but it's only like 1,440 days or thereabouts, right? And you have 300 million people. So you just don't actually have, it's like when you're steering that, okay, 300 million people one day, right? What does that mean? How many centuries of time is that you spend for every one day? It's like this giant, huge group of people to steer it is so heavy, right? To move it is so heavy. To do something with it is so heavy. I guess this is basically the fundamental thing that I do disagree with. Actually, both MAGA and BBB on. You know, MAGA is Make America Great Again. That's a Trump, right? But Joe Biden's is Build Back Better. So both of them sort of kind of know that things have gone downhill. Implicitly, things have gotten worse. Let's make it better. But they're not in touch with, here's another graph. This is a really important graph that shows that the center of the world economy has moved. And it was for thousands of years in Asia, and then it went for hundreds of years during the Industrial Revolution out to the West. Peak West was 1950, and then it's rocketed back to the East faster than it came in decades, right? So thousands of years, hundreds of years, and then decades. Okay? So the entire world order, the post-war order, is based on 1945. But that's actually an exceptional time in world history. And so everything that was set up then, like the UN, like we were talking about earlier, everything that was set up then is obsolete now. It simply doesn't reflect the true balance of power. There's formal institutions that were set up, but like, for example, the US, UK, France, and Russia and China are the 4 Security Council members. So rather than trying to reform that, BRICS just started up a new thing, And so you have Russia and China, but you also have India there as like a founding member, right? And and you definitely don't have France. I mean, nothing against France, but it's declined since then. And so the thing is that MAGA and BBB are both based on trying to restore this, and it's here already. right? They're like, we're going to bring the jobs back. No, you're not. No, it's like, it's just not what the world was totally, in 1945, 1950, the rest of the world was completely bombed out. It was under communism. It was under socialism. Japan had been nuked. Like, people were dead. The entire industrial base was blown up. That's why a high school grad in the US could support a family without an education or whatever, right? Or much in the way of skills. The equivalent, like, research mathematician level person in China was starving to death, right? Is that fair? I don't think that's fair. That's looked at as a Garden of Eden idyllic time. I understand why it's in the American memory that was a great time and we should have kept it and so on and so forth. But the other 96% of the world roughly had a terrible time of it at that time. And they've risen and their fortunes have improved, right? And so much, when you bring up these kinds of graphs, right, you'll often get denialism from Americans who say, oh, you're being a doomer. Of course we can bring it back. We roll up our sleeves and so forth. But it's not just like one graph. There's like 1,000 of these, and I can show you all kinds of things have shifted. You just can't bring back a previous world state. What you can do is think about what is the ideal future world state we can achieve given the current momentum and position of the system. And so for that, I don't put that much confidence in Biden, or, not so much even, Trump is certainly, like, he deserves respect after surviving everything he survived, right? Don't get me wrong. But if I had confidence in somebody, more confidence, it'd be actually in like Elon and Zuck and, the tech leaders and the tech founders. We talk about heads of state. I have more confidence in the heads of network who have built and run these giant companies, because they have actually genuine control over their organization. They can hire, they can fire. They built it from scratch. They know where every screw is, right? It was built within living memory. So it's like a motorbike that they can ride versus this giant, gargantuan thing that's built over generations that nobody understands how the whole thing works.
While I do wish to ask you about the tech world a lot more, this is an American politics special now.
Sure.
And we're almost at the end of the episode. Is it almost certain that Trump's going to win this election now?
I wouldn't say that. And the reason I wouldn't say that is it's 4 months away. So many things can happen in 4 months. So many things. I mean, think about how Twitter works, right? To be clear, does he have probably a way better shot than he did in 2016 or 2020? Yes, probably. That's all. What all the polling says. You can kind of feel the energy and so on and so forth. But we're in such an unstable time for the world. Literally, they could have nuclear war with Russia between now and then. The global economy could collapse because this fizzing stick of dynamite that I mentioned, the economy's there. There could be more violence, God forbid, or just crazy things, right?
Like in the Indian context, there's a certain number of extreme right people who are going to vote right and extreme left people are going to vote left. So then it's the people in the center who sway the election either side.
Yeah.
So center right, center left, what will sway them to either side when in the American context?
Well, so the Hamas's attack on Israel definitely swayed a lot of people who are center left to Trump. BLM swayed a lot of people to Trump. Inflation has swayed a lot of people against Biden to Trump, because if you're on you and I will notice food getting expensive, right? And I could only imagine, if you're on like a low wage salary and to deal with 25% devaluation of the dollar over the last 4 years, and it's probably an underestimate, people are just getting choked to death by the inflation, and that all manifests under Biden's term. And it was something where the Fed and Treasury denied it and said it was transitory for a long time, if you remember that, right? Before they hiked rates to the moon. So they basically faked out the whole economy and actually broke a lot of things by doing that. So it's the Hamas, there's BLM, there's inflation, there's the state of blue cities, where essentially the homeless industrial complex is being paid to let people die on the street and hand them syringes and so on. There's just insane levels of wokeness in general in the school system, where people are taught that men and women don't exist and the kind of thing. There's the internet censorship. There's just a lot. There's a lot, man. There's a lot of things that have gone wrong in America over the last 10 years in particular. Partly what's happened, as I said, is it got destabilized. It's like you ever wheel a suitcase at the airport and it gets hit and it's like rocks this way, and then you try and stabilize it with your wrist and it rocks that way. And sometimes you can like restabilize it in time, but sometimes it goes and then it just falls over, right? And I see the swings in the system getting stronger like this. I don't see them stabilizing. It's not like a pendulum where it's like someone says like, oh, the pendulum will swing back. Okay, but what if it swings off? Because I'm seeing the amplitudes getting larger, right? And I'm actually also seeing like the swing to the left and the swing to the right happening at the same time, where you're having, as I said, like the trans surgeries for kids and also abortion bans, and the center of safe, legal, and rare of the 90s is lost, right? Just as an example. So here's why this is actually such a big deal, okay? It's less of a big deal for non-Americans, but you don't even realize this. Okay, think about when's the last movie you saw where you see Transformers?
Yeah.
Okay, you see the Marvel movies?
Yeah.
Okay, so the U.S. military is a good guy in Transformers, right? And who's the big star of the Marvel movies?
Superheroes.
Yes, but who's the main one? Captain America. Okay, if you go and look at many movies, there's a climactic scene where they go to the White House for the decision. Okay, whether it's Independence Day from the 1990s, there's lots of movies, science fiction movies where aliens land, they go to the White House for the decision, and so on and so forth, right? And we take that for granted. It's just in the backdrop, right? But there's a movie called Don't Look Up. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a really important movie. Here's why. That came out, I think, 2021. If you watch Contagion, which came out 2010, and then Don't Look Up, there's another movie in a sense. They're not part of a trilogy, okay? But conceptually, they're part of a trilogy. There's something coming in 2030, and here's why. Contagion portrays a deadly virus, but a highly competent U.S. government and CDC. You know, with consummate professionals who are willing to risk their lives for the people, and so on and so forth. And if you don't have direct experience of something, you're going to rely on the Hollywood image of it to fill in the gaps.
Wow. Go on.
It's actually a very deep point, right? Like, name some place you haven't been. You're going to rely on name some time you haven't seen, right? Well, what do you think about the Wild West? Have you researched it for yourself? No. You're going to think it probably looks like the Hollywood movies, right? So huge parts of your mental furniture is filled in by things that could be cardboard and you don't even know it. You have to like push on it and you'll see if it falls over. So during 2020, we all pushed on the cardboard of the CDC and it just fell over crank like this. And every US institution was just pure Potemkin nothingness. Like, here's a great example. Like, so if I had read this in 2018, see, it says, new biodefense strategy combats man-made and natural threats, September 18th, 2018. A living document, right, is critical for our defense. So this was at the Spanish flu epidemic. See, they were aware of Spanish flu. They even used a photo of Spanish flu, right? A cabinet-level biodefense steering. This approach best suited for carrying out the strategy operationally. New techniques, right? You know, a range of threats from nations to individuals, right? This was a naturally occurring outbreak. The threats are real and growing. And so they allocated this money. Like in 2018, if I just read this, I said, okay, well, that's good that they're on top of this, right? Now we realize that this was just purely vaporware. See, if you evaluate startups for a living, there are guys who can do like a good slide deck, but then they can't actually build a company, right? Or there's people who can do a good slide deck and build a company, but they can't build as good as Zuck. You know, execution actually matters. It's not just the writing and so on and so forth. However, if we can't observe the execution, all we can go off is the writing. You know, they, like if somebody gives you a pitch and says they're doing a social network, you'll say, okay, you know, well, show me the details and what are the metrics and so on, and you're putting in your money. When they say we're solving the homeless problem for the government, you don't diligence it in the same way. Because you see what I'm saying, right? You just trust the label that's on the tin, but it's not necessarily accurate, right? In fact, it's often optimized to be inaccurate as to what they're actually doing. They're often not solving the homeless problem, but making it worse because they have more budget, the more homeless there are. It's like the Feed the Pigeons Society. More pigeons, more budget. For more pigeons, we need more money for more of the pigeons, right? So, why did I get out of this? The trilogy, right? Contagion 2010 showed a competent U.S. government. Don't Look Up 2021. It was supposed to be a parable about climate change, but frankly, it could be anything. It also shows the decision coming up to the U.S. government, in particular to the White House. But this time, they make a bumbling hash of the whole thing. And everybody's portrayed as completely incompetent and so on, and the bad guys win and the meteor hits or what have you, okay? But there's still an implicit thing there, you know what it is? Despite all that bumbling, that the world will still look to America for leadership, to DC and the White House for leadership. But by 2030 or 2035, that won't be the case on the current trajectory. And even the best case scenario, I think, is like red America preserves some freedom and like blue America, because the debt is too much. It can't be actually reversed, right? Like, you know, I did this analysis. So this chart shows gross issuance of treasuries quarterly, meaning how much debt is the U.S. government, how much is it borrowing every quarter, okay? And you can see this spike of like $7 trillion it did in That was actually at like close to 0% interest rates. Take a look. Wait a second. It's borrowing almost as much as it did during have you heard a lot of reporting about it being a like financial emergency? And by the way, they're borrowing at like 5% rates here. Big difference. So you're borrowing record or close to record amounts of money at decadal high rates. And that's why the payments are just going like that. It's somebody who's completely bankrupt and maxing out their credit cards to eke out a few more months, maybe past the election, maybe not. There's a time bomb on the world economy.
What's the longest time that the time bomb can go on?
I honestly don't know. See, you know what it actually reminds me a lot of? So look at this, right? With Biden, they hid and they denied and they hid and they denied and they denied, and then it just got mark to market. Okay? Biden himself is a metaphor for the post-war order. Denying while declining. Okay? He hasn't named a successor. He uses every lever of formal power possible to hold on to his status. He doesn't care if he's doing a good job or not. He's just incredibly like status greedy. Just cares about the title, you know, and so forth. And there's no plans for a graceful handover, no plans for power sharing, no plans for anything, just total. And in fact, if you were to plan, you'd be on the outs with them, right? The administration couldn't plan, right? They'd fire you or it'd be taboo or something. And so that means that the eventual like windup of this is going to be messy beyond belief. Much messier than it need to be. I mean, just think about it. Like when you're parking your car in the garage, do you slow down? You do. Otherwise, you smash right into the wall, right? It's like there's certain kinds of things. You're going down the stairs. If you expect a step and you've got set expectations, you can take the step. You can decline in a gradual way. Or you can just hit the wall at 1,000 miles an hour in just a denial about how bad it is, right? And this is the kind of thing that also came to, for example, SVB, right? It was alive and then it was dead. Life was analog and death was digital. You know, Peter Thiel's 0 to 1?
Yeah.
This is 1 to 0. Okay. And a lot of these failed banks look like that, where there's very little warning, you know, like, hey, things are climbing and so on. And like literally a few days later, just gone, dead, flatline, kaput, right? So we're in a high volatility time. And the reason I brought the movie point up and then to the thing is 2010 Contagion, 2021 Don't Look Up, 2030, 2035, everybody's going to need to figure out the world on their own, and they need new stories that don't put the White House at the center. And it sounds like a small thing, but it's actually a massive thing. It's an enormous, enormous thing because the USA has set itself up as the dispute resolver for lots and lots and lots of countries. It's got the military bases everywhere. And one fine day, it just goes. You know, like, it's like the USSR where it said everything was forever until it was no more, the last Soviet generation. And that it's a great book because it captures the fact that the regime didn't plan for its own mortality. Communism was going to last forever. And then it just unwound. And I feel that unwinding. And the thing is, here's another way of putting it. With the Biden thing, Republicans at least had an incentive to call this out, right? Because they wanted to, win an election. But Americans in general don't have an incentive to be sort of outside of their own head and say, here's the situation with the economy or what have you. Oh my God, you're anti-American, you're talking us down, blah, blah, you're not marking us, what are you doing, right? And I get that, I totally get that. However, you have to sometimes just face reality, right? And so I'll show you this post, right? You remember this one, right, with this graph? So I posted this graph. I said, the economy isn't real. It's propped up by record debt. They will fake it till they break it. Fake it till you make it? Yeah. This is fake it till they break it. And then this guy, which is funny, he had this kind of smart ass reply where he's like, oops, he's not the worst guy, by the way. Brent, if you're watching this, I have no beef with him, but he likes to be a smart ass in the comments. He's like, oops, you only showed one side of the balance sheet. Common mistake though. And he's basically saying, oh, don't worry about it, dude. The USA is such a rich country. It has $170 trillion in assets and liabilities. So therefore, you're showing some tiny debt that we're going into. No big deal. We can easily pay it off. So I laughed and laughed and laughed when I saw that. And here's why. Because here's the graph that he showed, right? But you know what the actual real graph is? You know what the title on this graph is?
What?
Balance sheet of households and nonprofit organizations. In other words, these are not the assets of the federal government. This is everything that every American owns. And now we start to glimpse endgame. It's not that the government goes bust. Remember, the government can also tax and it can inflate. So it's on the hook to pay Social Security. It's on the hook to pay military bills, right? It's on the hook. It's made all these promises to all these allies and all these supporters, and it needs cash to do that. And so it'll take everything you got and throw it in the wood chipper to try to satisfy those obligations if you're within U.S. government control. Okay? So the thing about this is once you start to understand endgame, right? Keynesianism, do you know what Keynesianism is? Okay. Keynesianism is the operating economic philosophy of the U.S. and Western Europe and so on and so forth. It's not communism. Communism is, go house to house and shoot you and take your money and take your farm and call it land reform, right? Instead, it's communism for wimps. Why is that? Because what Keynesianism does is it hits a key and it prints money and it steals money from everybody, but you don't feel it. Remember the thing I was saying where you went from 1 out of 10 shares to 2 out of 100 shares? You were silently diluted down without knowing, and they just allocated the other 90 shares to their friends. And it seems like, in fact, your balance went up, but then you have less purchasing power and you don't know what's happening to you, right?
The extra notes printed by one cohort of people affects the money and the wallets of all the other cohorts without them knowing.
Exactly. The purchasing power, let's call it that, right? They're taking away purchasing power while they're giving you bills. Water everywhere, not a drop to drink. Printer everywhere, no money for anything, right? And so it's like you're drowning in salt water if you could drink some of it. You're drowning in useless paper if you could spend some of it, right? And so the thing about Keynesianism, it sees no difference between household and government assets. They don't have any upper limit. They want to do 90% marginal tax rates. They want to do unrealized cap gains taxes and so on, right? You are, like, as an American, they're tax cattle for the government that's made all these promises to people. And they don't see any limit. They're not like, oh, and the Constitution says 20% maximum tax. There's no upper limit. They don't morally, or the only thing is, can they ram through the law? Okay. So American household assets can and will be taken to pay for what that failed state owes. And how much does it owe? So it's not actually even 37 trillion. It's not even 78.4 trillion. When you actually dig in, okay, and this, by the way, is the February 24th financial report of the United States government. I always, whenever I do anything, I always give all the links so you can actually go and see. Here it is. So this is PDF from their website, okay? And what does it say? The total of resources needed for all the programs sums to, can you see that number? What does it say?
175.3 trillion.
Wow. Okay, just hover with that number. What does that actually mean? We're in monopoly money territory now at this point. Okay. We are nearing quadrillion. We're okay. Just to put this, the entire US federal government only collected 1.86 trillion last year. So imagine you were making $18,000 a year and you were like $1.7 million in debt, with the debt increasing every day faster than you're obviously completely, totally done. It's only a matter of when it's marked to market. This system is bankrupt. This order will end, and will end in the most ridiculously messy way possible. That's one of the reasons I'm here, to tell Indian policymakers. I'm going to show a zillion graphs in the next segment. Okay, graph after graph after graph. And so this number, I mean, dig into everything I'm saying. Like, look at it, tell me I'm an idiot, fine, but at least look at the numbers. The number, by the way, that 1.86 trillion, that's juiced by deficit spending. The dollar is down 25% in real terms. You couldn't even, $177 trillion. We're talking, it would be hard to sell $1 trillion worth of assets. It's hard to sell $1 billion worth of assets. You tank the market on something. So these numbers are fantasy numbers, okay? What it basically means is, the U.S. government does not have nearly enough to pay for what it owes. It's made promises to everyone, from allies to retirees, that it simply can't keep. And to hang on to power amidst that web of broken obligations, it is going to get nasty on a level beyond which most can really comprehend. Now, here's the thing. I know it sounds, it's funny. Everybody, you've seen Terminator, right? So you have some mental model of what the world looks like if an evil cyborg time machine came. Okay, you've seen movies with aliens. You've seen movies with ghosts. You've seen all kinds of scary movies like that. But you actually haven't seen a scary movie on, probably, is something like what I'm talking about, like what happened under communism. Right? So you don't have a mental model for it. So it seems you don't have a story that you can hook it on. Like if I told you, people actually, what's interesting, they get less freaked out by discussing AIs that can kill everybody than they do by this. Do you know why? It's because there's like a hook. There's like some existing story that's been prepped for it somehow. They feel they can engage with it more rationally. Whereas this seems like, oh my God, that's so crazy, man. Is it actually going to happen? But let me show you something. So this guy posted this graph, which is the most important financial graph of all time. Persist while others quit. Okay. Tech bubble burst, right? And it's basically saying, just keep holding on in the market. You'll keep making money. It'll keep going up and to the right, and so on and so forth, right? And this is presented as the most important financial graph because it just keeps going up. Now, under the hood, what's actually happening is the federal government is printing money to have it go up, right? So it's not an organic process like that. But the deeper point is that the conclusion is wrong. The conclusion says, just stick around and it'll always go up and to the right. In reality, because he's saying I'm not against this kid or whatever, nothing wrong with this kid, right? But perhaps the most important financial graph of all time, what's the lesson? And here's my lesson. If you actually zoom out and you actually look at what the full, you say, right? Many countries did not persist and get good returns. In Russia, negative 100%. China, negative 100%. Germany, negative 100%. Japan, negative 96%. There are only 3 countries in the world where you actually had compounding through the century: US, Canada, Australia. Everybody else got zeroed out. So what I'm describing is not even historically unusual. It's just something that there's no story of that. Like, Americans are more prepared for like a nuclear attack or an alien invasion than the complete collapse of the currency and the economy.
Thanks for this. Because the basics about American politics we get to know through political commentators in India, but this is like a very deep dive. So thank you, Balaji Srinivasan. That was the episode for today, ladies and gentlemen. If you enjoyed this one, we've recorded 2 stellar podcasts in the past, and one podcast that's recorded with him already is yet to be released. It will be released in the next few weeks. Is a lot more about the general world of geopolitics and India, China, and America's geopolitical role when it comes to shaping up the future of our planet. That was an even more incredible conversation than this one. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you did, make sure you share it with your friends and family. TRS and the entire team will be back very soon.